So, bless Tim Wilson's heart. He was willing to fill his out for you. So here are your choices. You could copy his, or not. So just a couple things I'm going to get out of the way. And Barb Gay told me it was okay to make this joke. If you were concerned that we're going to just line these up on the wall and pick the lowest dollar amount, like a dollar store shopping trip, we are not doing that, okay? The point of this document, I want all of you to think back, those of you who are part of the funding the last time around, almost everyone should raise their hand because you probably got a question about explain how you apply your United Way dollars to the activities that you're conducting in this strategy. How many of you got a question like that? Everybody's just nodding, you're like, yeah, whatever. Every year you ask us that question. Yes, we want to stop asking that question. Here's what happens. The volunteers struggle to understand how the dollars buy something. They want to know, are we buying like a leg? Are we buying the head of somebody? Are we buying crayons? They're very concrete. On the other hand, the stuff we fund typically is a slice of the larger work that you're doing, right? We don't fund everything. We fund, for some of you, a small bit. We're the dollars that run in between all the other grant funding and all that other stuff, okay? But it's hard for us to say that to volunteers. We fund in between, doesn't fly. So what we need to do is create a picture for them of the larger context of the funding and the activity streams. Because again, I'll use Abby as an example. We're funding work with Abby, Center for Community Mental Health. And essentially, we were funding a portion of some FTE's time. But the reality was, without that portion of time, there was a larger program that couldn't happen. Okay? For some of you, we fund work that happens while people are waiting for eligibility determinations, right? So if we're funding that, we're still a piece of a larger whole, and the volunteers need to see that larger whole. And oftentimes, too, I'll use ASAC as an example here. Your prevention work and education is a big piece that leads to and connects to some other very specific activities that have larger costs and lower numbers served. So what we're asking you to do is give yourself credit for the lower cost, larger numbers served, all the way to the smaller number served, higher cost activities. Does that make sense? And also I've gotten a question. And we've said this to most of you before, but those agency exec advisory members read this RFP and looked at the tools before we published them to all of you. And so they asked us some of these questions ahead of time. So why are you asking me to put an admin rate on this form? It is not, again, this is not a garage sale. We are not going to look for the lowest admin rate and say, that must be the right work. We are not. And for those of you who at least chuckled when I said that, you get extra points on your RFP. Yes. So, if you think I'm funny, you do better. If you don't think I'm funny, you'll do worse. That's the way it's going to be. Okay, see, now everybody knows. And you'll complain about me later when you leave, and I can live. So the admin rate is, the point of admin rate is this. If you can't turn on the lights, and if you can't pay for leadership, and if you can't pay for grants administration, and those kinds of things, you can't run your organization, right? So, we need to put some of this stuff on paper so that people begin to take into consideration that none of this work gets done for free. There are costs to operating effective organizations, and that's the point of this. This is not a shopping list where we're just going to pick. I had a board member ask me, it was Whitworth, will you just pick whoever offers you the cheapest price on a service? And that is not the point. The reason we're asking you to tell us all that other stuff at the front end, talk about your client population, help us understand what their uniquenesses are, because we know this is a big puzzle, right? And there isn't one of you in this room that isn't doing something good and worthy and serving people who need you. So for us, the challenge is, how do you allocate dollars against a backdrop of a lot of really good agencies doing really good work that we tell the volunteers they're on their own. So what we're trying to do is give them tools to make informed decisions. If there are suggestions that you have to make this a little more helpful, or if you have questions for us about how to use this, don't hesitate. It's the first time we've used it. And I was standing in the back of the room listening to Barb and Laurel talk about being asked for information on another grant application where clearly people were using new materials. It's always a risk when we haven't used something yet that we'll ask you a question and go, oh, crap, I didn't think it would work like that. Okay? But you need to tell us if it's not working. It's why we asked Tim to be our guinea pig, to try and give you some examples. Everyone's form will be different. You might have 2 lines filled out. You might have 3 of these. We've asked you to use a different one based on different intermediate outcomes. So if there's a different assortment of activities, you want to distinguish that with this form. It's not intended to be time intensive, but it is intended to help the volunteers understand the components of the work. Because if you do everything from short-term education to long-term case management, the cost of those services are distinctly different, right? And you need to have that reflected in a way that serves your purpose. So it should relate to your logic model. If you're reporting activities or things you're going to measure on your logic model, there should be a connection to this sheet. Okay?
Leslie, can we give Tim a moment to maybe just comment to maybe how it worked for you to fill that in, or any input you want to add?
Well, probably this is not the first thing that you want to do. Let me ask first, how many of you have completed your form? Yeah, okay. It's probably not the first step in the process. There was a lot of, I think, work I needed to do and just do a little bit of guesstimating on some things because we haven't gone through the process of developing a proposal yet. But I think the process is going to be very, having gone through this, the process is going to be very helpful. I think to some extent for the United Way, being able to say to potential donors, hey, for this many dollars, you can provide this much shelter, or this many Meals on Wheels, or this many weeks of after school programming, or whatever, for this many dollars. But it's helpful. It's definitely going to be helpful for us to be able to do that for the things that for these particular activities that we've costed out. I guess I don't really have any words of wisdom about the approach other than just to make notes on whatever kind of calculations you're doing. Make careful notes of that so that when you're looking at this 6 months later or a year later, wondering how the heck did I come up with with that you can actually go back and say what all your figures were, what all your calculations and assumptions of numbers served and that kind of thing.
And I would, and I haven't asked their permission, so maybe they'll forgive me, but Salvation Army, I'm going to use you guys again. An example of how I think this form will serve people is they're going to want to do a line around their meals. Then they're going to want to do a line around their less intensive case management strategies, and then their more intensive case management strategies. They cost a different amount of money. They last a different amount of time. And part of what Tim and I talked about early on, too, is we know that for some of you, certain activities are what I'm an ex-retailer, loss leaders. There's stuff you do that you lose money on, right? And then there's stuff you do that you use the funding to sort of grease the wheels for the stuff that costs you more. This is where you can help volunteers understand how you're putting the puzzle together. So when we ask you to talk about, and I think it's on the next slide, revenue streams that support the strategy, funding restrictions that impact your service delivery, this is what we mean. How many of you get government funding? And they're like really flexible, and you can kind of apply it the way you want to, right? Okay, so you'll laugh at the government. I guess that should be my joke line for the rest of the day. But the point is that you end up doing a lot of very prescriptive funding and reporting. You can do some services and not another. People need to demonstrate eligibility before you can bill, all of that stuff. So how does that, and we're not asking you to be exhaustive, but just literally, we get these 3 sources of grant funding. They restrict our use of dollars to the following, and therefore, okay? We're just looking for a little context, okay? Because again, for the volunteers, it helps them understand how our money fits. And it reminds them, and us, that we are a small piece of what you all do, okay? We're a small piece, but we need to be clear about what that piece is. And this question, we always ask it. It's hard to ask, it's hard to answer. But generally speaking, and John Geringer is one who tells us this all the time, what funds are you able to access because United Way dollars are used as a match? So I frankly don't care if you use this as a match 17 times for 17 different grants. I don't care. Just tell us. It gives us a sense, again, and this is for the volunteers' benefit, that sometimes it's not about whether or not you were going to get $7 from us, but the fact that you do get $7 from us turns into 21. That's another consideration for our funding decisions. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, this is not an exact science. Do your best with it. It's helpful to us to understand it. And funds you would be eligible to receive, again, if there's some new funding opportunity where we would be part of a match, but this needs to be pretty concrete. It should not be, if you give us money, other people will like us more, and they will give us more money. That may or may not be true.